Today I'm going to talk about fire, and how many of you guys use fire as part of your job? So a good portion of you. And I guess you're primarily working with fire with private landowners. Is that what you're primarily doing? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and the goals of using prescribed fire, and then get into a little bit the effects of prescribed fire. I'm going to talk about this in relation to upland hardwood ecosystems. I'm not going to talk about fire in pine forest at all. I'm not going to talk about fire as a tool in controlling wildfire. Okay, so my talk today is really about using prescribed fire as a tool to achieve some objective that you have. And as Julie mentioned, I'm a research forester based in Huntsville, Alabama. We're physically located at Alabama A&M University, which is called Normal, Alabama, which is kind of a funny name. And Callie Jo, she's not here. She couldn't make it at the last minute, but she is the team leader there in Huntsville, Alabama, and leads our subunit down there. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about eastern upland hardwood forest. I'm not going to talk about pine forest at all. I'm going to talk a little bit about history of fire, and John Blanton talked about this earlier today, about the history of fire, the Native Americans' use of fire, the natural role fire has in our ecosystem. And I'm going to talk about the effects of fire. In this, the literature out there is a little bit scant in terms of what the effects of fire are. There's lots of case studies out there. There's not a lot of replicated studies looking at fire. And this is my slide that says we really don't know anything. I mean, you know, when John Blanton asked me, what's our natural fire regime in oak, I can't answer that question. I really don't know. And I don't know if anyone really knows, because it depends on what time period you're talking about. If you're talking about from 1880 to 1900, the fire regime interval was probably every year. You know, if you're talking about 1491, I'm not sure what fire return interval was in oak forest, because there's not a lot of stands, old growth stands, virgin stands that exist that we can reconstruct that history. There's a little bit of pollen records that people can look at, but that doesn't give you a yearly time interval. It just kind of gives you a gross estimation of how much fire was used and how much fire was here on the landscape. So really, we don't know a lot about fire in eastern upland hardwood forest. I think we have a better handle on fire probably in the west, because it's been used out there more frequently. Fire is probably a more natural component of the ecosystem out there, because it's higher frequency of lightning strikes that cause fire out there. Here, when it burns, when we get lightning here, we get rain. So not a lot of times does lightning really create a large-scale fire. It can create fire in the east, but not large scale like it does out west. And this is a picture of Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service. And he talks about how when he was first getting started, how there wasn't any land that was really being managed. And this is in fact why the Forest Service came to be, because there was so much waste and so many forests being degraded across the United States, that this is really why the Forest Service came to be. We wanted a better way to manage our lands and to conserve those lands. So he talks about how to waste timber was a virtue, not a crime, and the lumbermen regarded forest devastation as normal and second growth as a delusion of fools. And so you can see from Gifford Pinchot's quote here that around 1900 and a little bit before that, the forests were really not being managed. They were just being used at will. There was no forethought into sustainability or what was going to come back after the forests were being cut or burned. And of course we had the chestnut blight, which we've heard a lot about from John Blanton. And before that we also had Phytophthora, which probably killed off all the chestnuts in the low-lying areas. And so the chestnuts probably made up in this area, you know, anywhere from 10 to 25% of all trees out there. So this was a huge factor in changing the species composition of our forest. And of course we have human impacts, which is the biggest impact, obviously. What this graph is showing, it's from the Delcourts, and they're Paul and Hazel Delcourt. They work in Oak Ridge, and they use pollen records and charcoal sediment records to reconstruct stand history over thousands of years. And what this is showing on the y-axis here is from zero time from present to 10,000 years ago. And this graph right here is charcoal accumulation rates. So you can see that from about 10,000 years ago, there was a presence of fire on the ecosystem. Okay, there was fire, you know, as long ago as 10,000 years ago. Moving all the way up to 1,000 years ago, fire started to increase. This was probably because the Native American population started to increase because they were using more agriculture. They were becoming better able to sustain themselves on the land. So they probably burned more. And then this huge peak in fire use around the turn of the century. And this is because the Europeans came in, they started to burn their fields and cut a lot of timber. The railroad systems came in, a lot of fires got started from the railroad systems. Charcoal, iron facilities came into being. So a lot of impacts on the landscape from fire are right around the turn of the century. And then we had fire suppression because we viewed fire as a negative thing because it was destructive at that time. So we stopped all fires. And now, from about 80 years ago to present, fire is still a major part of the landscape, even more, really, at least from what these data show, than historically. And that's something I want y'all to remember. Because what we hear a lot is that we need to restore fire on the landscape. But this graph is showing fire is really at levels higher than it was going back 8,000 years ago. But you have to take that with a grain of salt. This is just from one site in Kentucky, I believe. So, you know, does it represent all of the southeastern United States? I'm not sure. And that arrow right there is showing you the time of European settlement. And then also we had grazing, which was a big impact, and we're not sure really the effects of grazing on the landscape at a large scale. This was from Spence Field. Have you guys ever been to Spence Field in the Smoky Mountains? It's now grown up with trees. It doesn't look anything like this. There's lots of mountain ash and sarvis and trees like that up there. But you can see from this picture it's really heavily grazed. There's not any trees on the landscape at all. People would run their cattle up there yearly from the valleys below, from Cades Cove. Indiscriminate logging, as you all know, the timber companies came in and really started to cut heavily around 1870, 1880 in this part of the woods. Uncontrolled fire, this was from out west. Again, the impacts of uncontrolled fire are probably greater out there than here. So all of these things, this contributed to the forests we have today, and John Blanton pointed out that the forests we have today are probably unlike any forest that we've seen ever in the history of Europeans being here and having documented evidence of what the forests have looked like. These forests today are different probably than forests that may have ever existed on the landscape. We don't really know. And Mark Abrams called that the perfect storm. So from 1860 to 1920, we had all these things coming together to create these forests that are disturbance-dependent ecosystems, and they have come together to create the forests you see today, which are heavily oak-dominated, hickory-dominated, but probably unlike forests we've ever seen on the landscape. So keep that in the back of your head as we go through the week and I go through this talk. So we had these forests that came in around 1900, and that's what we have out here today, and that's what we were trying to get back because, you know, people don't like change. So we see an oak forest, we want to keep the oak forest, right? We don't really like to change things too much. So we like the oaks because they're pretty, they provide lots of mast, they're good for wood, but we have this problem. We can't figure out how to get the oaks back. So once these 100-year-old forests start going away, in the understories coming up maple, and if there's a disturbance, coming up yellow poplar. We're not getting our oaks back. And some people believe it's part due to fire suppression because there's evidence that oaks are very tolerant of fire, benefit some from fire. So we had fire suppression, regrowth of our forests, and the oaks followed. And then when you have a disturbance, or you don't have any disturbance, you don't get oak, you get either maple or beech, or you get yellow poplar. And this is what we've called the oak regeneration problem, which you're going to hear more about from Dr. Loftus. So, kind of shift gears here and talk a little bit about using fire as a tool on our landscape. And this is a graph I pulled from the Interagency Coordination Center showing from 1998 to 2006 how much fire has been used on state lands, federal lands. And you can see that the U.S. Forest Service, shown in blue here, fire use has increased since 1998 and increased quite a bit from about 500,000 acres to 1.5 million acres. So that's a lot of use of fire on the landscape. And on federal land, it's primarily used for fuel reduction. So when you see a burn plan from the National Forest System, and it'll say goal of the prescribed fire, it'll say fuel reduction most of the time, because that's where the money's coming from. They're getting money to burn to reduce fuels, because out west we have all these big fires, lots of fuel issues out west. Things don't degrade very quickly out there, so fuels build up. You get a fire, it's a major impact. Not so much here in the east, but we're still burning to reduce fuel in the east, even though fuel reduction, as I'll show later, may not be such an issue. State land use of fire has also increased dramatically since 1998. So now I'm going to talk about the history of fire and what we know about the history of fire. And just keep in your heads that I'm not talking about a static point in time. I'm talking about the dynamic changes in history of use of fire. So Native Americans, as John Blanton pointed out, were heavily populated across the United States. This is a reconstructed drawing of what a Native American settlement would have looked like around 1100 AD. And this is a quote from 1632, and it talks about how the Indians burned twice a year. So obviously they used fire for a lot of different reasons. The pollen record, which I showed earlier from the Delcourts, this is another pollen record. And you can see again where that line is the European settlement. And you can see this peak in charcoal accumulation rates and also in oak abundance. So we may have more oak now than we've ever had historically. That's what these data show. Again, it's kind of limited evidence because it's one site, but it kind of indicates that. Also, we can use tree rings to reconstruct stand history. This is a stand, I think this is from the Northeast. And basically what you want to look at, number of individuals on the y-axis, year of recruitment on the x-axis. And you see this big peak right here, right around that time, that perfect storm time, 1870, 1880. Very typical. There's been dozens of studies published just like this. And I've got one I'm working on from Swanee. So they're showing the exact same thing. This is from a stand that a lot of people think is old growth or virgin timber. Well, no, it's not, because look right here. There's this big peak of recruitment, which tells me that something happened around 1870 to create those oaks. Something happened. So I think after the Civil War, people started rebuilding Swanee, and just like they did everywhere else, they had to get timber, and they went into Dick Cove and they cut it out, and that created a disturbance that the oaks favored. So there's some experimental tests out there. There's not that many. There's case studies, which I call a case study something that's not replicated. It's something that was done one place at one period of time, and it can give you good information. There's nothing wrong with case studies at all, but the problem is the results from that can only be applied to that one particular stand in that one particular time. There's tons of these case studies out there looking at fire. The results are conflicting. They're not often agreeing with each other if you examine one and try to compare it to the other. They're not really statistically sound. You can't apply statistics because you don't have replication. So that kind of limits your inferences from these kind of studies. A lot of times they're biased. I mean, I've read studies where I look at their results and then I read their discussion, and I don't really like the way they've interpreted their results. There's replicated studies, but there's very few because it's very difficult to put large-scale replicated studies in on the ground. Very, very difficult. It's expensive. It's very time-consuming. It's hard to find the land base to do that. So you're talking about replication. We would want 50 replicates if we could get it, because it's, the more replicates you have, the better estimate you can make. And Callie always uses the example, if you take her height and say this applies to all women in the United States, then all women in the United States must be 5'3". But then you take her height and my height and you combine them, then you have a little bit better estimate of what women's height in the United States is. And it's the same way with any kind of study you're looking at. You want lots of replicates, but the problem is it's hard to put those replicates in on the ground. And these are just, I don't know, these are probably hard to read, but these are just studies that you can look up, or we could help you find them if you want to look them up, and we could give them to you. And there's other studies that are just getting started. These are studies that have a lot of funding behind them, and they have a lot of replication. And they're fire surrogate studies. There's one of these actually located really close to here, about 50 minutes away, Katie, or so. Katie's involved with some of that study. And basically the fire surrogate study is looking at different levels of thinning and then one level of burning, whether it's burned or not burned, and looking at the effects on vegetation, animals, insects, everything you can imagine. And then the Joint Fire Sciences Program is another program that helps fund fire studies. And mainly they've been funding things out west. It's really hard to get money from the Joint Fire Sciences to do studies in the east. And then there's something called the Fire Learning Network, which I wish Beth Buchanan was still here because she could tell us a little bit more about that. I'm not as familiar with that, but it's basically going to be a tool that managers can use to learn from one another about how to put fire in on the ground and the effects that's having. It's not really science-based. It's more just observational, but still, I think it would be a good tool. So the goals, so you guys know more about this than me. I mean, you guys are out there burning, but typically the goals are related to wildlife habitat. People burn because they want to be able to see better through the woods, or they want to actually create something for the wildlife that the wildlife will like. There's vegetation. People want to burn because they want some species back, or they want to get rid of some species. There's fuels reduction, which again, I really struggle with this one because I don't think we're really reducing fuels in the east by burning. I think out west it's a great tool. Out west things don't degrade as fast because it's not as moist. In the east we have lots of moisture, lots of rainfall. Things decompose quickly. We don't really have a fuels problem in most areas. Some areas we do, but not really. Whoops. And then administrative reasons. This always gets the National Forest System people upset when I say this, but really when you ask them why they're burning, well, they have to burn because they get money to burn. They get X number of dollars to burn X number of acres, and that's why they're burning it. Not because that's not the sole reason, but that in some areas, that's why they're burning. But if you ask the manager about it, they'll say, well, really, because we want to promote all these other things. We want oak, we want wildlife, but the money is coming to reduce fuels, and that's not really why they're burning. So Katie gave me this slide to use a while ago, and it's from one of the fire surrogate studies. And basically the data show that, well, let me just back up. In 2001, this was before the treatments were implemented, okay? On the y-axis you have mean species richness. It's simply the number of species that they counted in birds. So in 2001, there was no statistical difference between the different treatments. The treatments being fire alone, fire and thinning together, thinning alone, and then a control. And then in 2002, that's when the treatments had been implemented. And Katie, you just speak up if I'm doing this wrong. You can see that species diversity went up on all sites. But amongst themselves, there's really no difference. There wasn't any difference between whether you burned it or didn't burn it, thinned it or didn't thin it. So species diversity went up probably because of a yearly effect. Maybe there was more rain that year, and so there was more birds. And then this was when the mechanical treatments were implemented right here. And then they got to burn it as well. And you can see there's really no difference still among the treatments. So it didn't really matter whether you burned it or thinned it or didn't do anything. The mean species richness was pretty much the same. And then after 2 years after all treatments being implemented, you can see the mechanical and the burn treatment together had more species richness than the other treatments. And it was borderline statistically different. So what this tells me is that, you can burn it and it's not really going to affect your bird species, but if you do a thinning and burning it, you're having more of an effect, which makes sense because that's changing the structure more than anything else, burning and thinning.
Stacy, what actually happened was that the fire and the thinning first and then burning was really hot. I think it was laying there for a whole year.
Right, killed a lot of the things, right.
So over time there were all these snags and trees falling down that really changed the structure a lot.
Right, so this treatment right here, if we had data showing the light levels or something like that, this treatment would stick out because it would have the most difference compared to the other treatments. In silviculture, people use fire a lot to get oak. They want to get oak, and so they think burning the forest will help them achieve that goal. And the question mark in my mind is still out on that. There's not many studies. I can't point to a single study that has shown that's published. It's just not out there. But we think that way because we see it observationally a lot of times, and then you see it when you have a wildfire or something come through, you see oak coming in, and we know that oak sprouts a lot, it has deep rooting, it has all these characteristics that allow it to respond after a fire's come through. But most often in silviculture, we get it to get advanced oak regeneration. So we don't want just the little 1-foot oaks. We want the big oaks. We want the 3-foot tall oaks. So we think maybe by burning it a few times, we'll get rid of the yellow poplars and the red maples. And then, after 2 or 3 years, those oaks will have grown up to about 3 feet in size. And that's the goal. And there's a system that's been developed that has been published in the Piedmont. And that's an important point. It's not in the mountains. It's not in the Cumberland Plateau. It's not in the Northeast. It's not anywhere except the Piedmont. So I don't know if it'll work anywhere else. But it's called the Shelterwood Burn System. It was published by Van Leer and Patrick Brose. And basically what they did was they took a stand, they cut it to about 30 or 40 square feet of basal area. They waited 3 years, then they burned it. They set a prescribed burn. And they did it for fall, spring, summer, and winter burns. They tested all those different seasons of burns. And let me just skip over. This is what they found right here, okay, where I'm pointing. They found that oak, after the spring burn, responded very well to fire. And summer burn, it also responded, but really it responded best in the spring burn. Maple, which is the competitor you don't want, went down. So this is really good results. I mean, this is excellent. This is a great thing. And a lot of people have adopted it to their ecosystems. I know people in Tennessee using this method. I'm not sure if it's going to work in Tennessee. It's not been tested, but people are adopting it and using it. Now, another study in Kentucky looked at fire and the effects on oaks and maple, and they found that oak increased slightly with fire, but maple really took off. So maple really liked fire in that study. So again, this is the problem with when you're trying to get one single answer about fire. Here's 2 studies, both replicated, that are getting very different results. And I always like to say, in this study, the maple gets mad with fire. In this study, the maple got sad with fire. And so totally two different results. So why the differences? Well, probably because in this study, they cut the stand, waited 3 years, and then burned it. So they cut it, they let light in on the ground, got that oak to respond. Everything else also responded, maple and poplar and everything else responded. But then you set a fire through it in the perfect time of year in the spring, and it kills off all those competitors, and the oaks are the ones that get favored. So this is a good take-home message. Really, I think burning by itself is not going to get you the oak that you want. I think you're going to have to open up the canopy and get some light in on the ground. But again, the jury's still out because this is only one study, and we're trying to repeat this. We've got studies in on the Daniel Boone and some other places looking at this. And this is just repeating what I just said. Brose and Van Leer, they had more oaks pre-burn because they cut the stand, and the author study did not. So can you replicate these results on better sites? That's the big question. And the fire, using prescribed fire, the main problem I have with it is it's hard to replicate. I can tell you if you take an herbicide can and go out and spray a tree, I can tell you what's going to happen. Exactly. But I can't tell you if you burn a stand what exactly is going to happen, because it's going to depend on lots of different things like weather, what time of year you're burning, the topography of the site. All those things are going to affect your fire. So fire is a very imprecise tool, very imprecise tool. It's not saying you shouldn't use it, but it's just very imprecise. Whereas if you want to cut a tree or herbicide a tree, you know exactly the results you're going to get. And maybe the reason people use fire more often than using something like herbicide is because if you have a team of people that you can go and you have the infrastructure built already, it's cheap, It's not very expensive. If you have the tools and you have the people, you can go out and burn. It's not very expensive. Now, this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about the fuels reduction and using fire to reduce fuels. And this is a big topic mainly for the National Forest System, not so much for you guys. But maybe some of your landowners hear about fuels problems and they want to know what effect they're going to have on fuels. So this is another fire surrogate study where they looked at the effect of fire on fuels. And this is 10-hour fuels. And I'm not going to really explain that, but basically it's just smaller fuels. So in 2000, no treatments had been implemented yet, and you can see the fuels were pretty much the same across all treatments. Then they burned it, and they thinned it. And in 2001, they had more fuels in the thin-only stand, which makes sense because you're cutting trees, tops of trees are falling down on the ground, and you're adding biomass. And then in the thin and burn, they also had more fuels. So you can see that really the fire didn't really reduce the fuels that much. And then after 3 years' time, they're all back to being the same. So there's not a lasting effect of the burning or the thinning really on the fuels. This is 1,000-hour fuels. This is the big fuels, the big logs that you have left on the ground. Basically, same results the year after. You had more fuels in the thin and burn. So thinning is definitely going to affect your fuels more than anything else, obviously. And then when you burn it, you're not really getting rid of those fuels. It's not really going away. Thinning is going to affect your fuel load more than burning it. So Brian McCarthy, in his conclusion, was that fire is not needed to manage fuels in this ecosystem, and this is an eastern upland hardwood ecosystem. Fuel loads do not accumulate because productivity and decomposition are largely in balance. So what he's saying is things decompose, the fuels aren't building up like they are in the east, so fuel management really isn't necessary in this ecosystem. Now, where you have mixed hardwood pine stands and you have southern pine beetle, that may be a major concern of yours, is to reduce fuels. Also, in stands where you have gypsy moth coming in, nobody's really looked at that, to my knowledge, about the fuel loading in gypsy moth stands, but I imagine that that's going to be a pretty large-scale problem, at least in the short term after the gypsy moth comes in. And then we're looking at some studies on the Bankhead National Forest. We're looking at effects of thinning and burning and different levels of thinning and different levels of burning on wildlife, fuel loads, residual oak tree damage. This is a question everyone asks. Am I damaging my oaks when I burn it? Some studies show you do, some studies show you don't. And then on the Daniel Boone, which is in Kentucky, we're looking at this oak woodland treatment, which I really struggle with, that terminology. I've not found oak woodland in any of my silviculture textbooks, so I'm not really sure when people say they're doing oak woodland treatments what that means. But basically, it's trying to go back to some kind of, condition that used to exist on the landscape. But there's not a lot of evidence to support that it used to actually exist. I mean, there is some limited evidence, but not a lot. So I'm really struggling with this oak woodland treatment. But we're looking at that treatment that involves thinning and it involves burning, and looking at the damage to the oaks, the age structure of the existing stand, and the regeneration response. And this is some of the stuff from the Bankhead National Forest that we found. It's very similar results to what I just showed you from the other fire surrogate study. And basically, you've got your treatments here on the x-axis, and then your fuel loading on the y-axis. And you can see that after you thin it, you get an increase in fuels, which is what you expect, right? And then you burn it, and things don't really change that much. The burning that they're doing on the Bankhead is not really reducing fuels that much, even though that's why they're burning. If you look at their burn plan, it says fuels reduction. So in conclusion, the fire as a tool, I think it's an imprecise tool, but I think you should definitely keep it available. As I said, if you've got the infrastructure there, you could do some changes on the ground with it, you should use it. But don't make it your only tool. You need to keep all these other things in mind, and you may want to really think about, using it in conjunction with other things like thinning or shelter wood cutting or some of those things. It'll be most effective at controlling stand structure. So you'll be most effective at reducing brush, at reducing some kind of density in the understory, more than controlling actual species composition. So if you want to get rid of your maple and get oak, fire is going to be a really hard tool to do that in the short term. I mean, maybe over 20 years of burning it, you might favor the oak. But studies are showing that really maple, if you've got an established maple sapling mid-story, it's going to be really hard to get rid of that with fire by itself because they sprout. In growing season burning, of course, will have the best results at creating that light environment that you want to get, but the shortest burn window. So it's hard to get those burns in the time you need to get them in. Fire has the best effect on oak regeneration as site quality decreases, which makes sense. As you go down in site quality, you get more oaks per acre anyway. Oak is less hard to regenerate on poor sites than it is mesic sites, and your competition goes down. And the fuels reduction, you probably can't use it to reduce fuels, at least in the short term. And I don't know how much you guys are influenced by administrative decisions, but I know in the National Forest System, they're largely influenced by administrative decisions. So I'm hoping in 10 years, maybe, we'll know a little bit more than we do now, but I think we're still going to have a lot of questions out there that we're not going to be able to answer. And that's my talk, I believe. So.